My name is Nora Sterling, and for most of my 58 years, my world has been defined by the steady, quiet rhythm of growing things. I was a botanist by trade, but a gardener by soul. My late husband, Richard, used to say I could coax life from a stone, and I suppose, in a way, that's what I'd always tried to do. Our home, a modest cedar-shingled house on the misty outskirts of Port Blossom, Washington, was my sanctuary. Its rooms were filled not with expensive things, but with the accumulated warmth of a life well-lived and well-loved. The scent of old books, lemon oil, and the damp, loamy earth from my garden clung to the very walls. Richard and I had built that life together, board by board, seed by seed. He was an architect, a man who understood foundations, and he had been mine. When he passed 2 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday morning as the autumn rain misted the windows, the foundation of my world crumbled. The silence he left behind was immense, a cavernous space where his laughter and the sound of his deliberate footsteps on the hardwood floors used to be. Grief, I learned, is not a storm, but a quiet, persistent fog that seeps into everything, blurring the edges of the world and making the familiar feel foreign. I found my solace where I always had, in the garden. I spent my days with my hands in the soil, tending to the heirloom roses Richard had planted for me, nurturing the delicate hellebores that bloomed even in the coldest months, and listening to the whispers of the wind through the tall Douglas firs that bordered our property. It was a solitary existence, but not a lonely one. I had my memories, my books, and the steady, reassuring cycle of the seasons. And I had my son, Daniel. After Richard's death, Daniel became my anchor. Every Sunday, he would drive the 40 minutes from the city with a thermos of dark roast coffee and a bag of still-warm cardamom buns from a Swedish bakery we both loved. We'd sit in the sunroom, the glass panes streaked with rain, and he would fill the silence. He'd talk about his work as a project manager for a construction firm, the funny quirks of his colleagues, his dreams of one day designing and building his own homes, just like his father. "You're not alone, Mom," he told me once, his hand covering mine on the worn wicker table. His hands were like Richard's, strong, capable, reassuring. "Dad made me promise I'd look after you. And I always will." I believed him with every fiber of my being. He was a good son, my Daniel. He had his father's gentle eyes and my quiet persistence. When the construction firm downsized 6 months later and his position was eliminated, I didn't hesitate for a moment. "Come home," I told him over the phone, his voice strained with a mixture of shame and frustration. "The guest room is yours. This house is still your home." "It's just for a little while, Mom," he insisted, the relief in his tone palpable. "Just until I get back on my feet." The first few months were a gift. It felt like turning back the clock to a simpler time. The cavernous silence of the house was filled once more with the sound of 2 people living. We fell into a comfortable routine. He'd make breakfast, I'd make dinner. We watched old black and white films in the evenings, a bowl of popcorn shared between us on the worn floral sofa. He repaired the loose step on the back porch, organized the garage, and helped me mulch the garden beds for winter. He was a comforting presence, a balm on the still raw wound of my grief. The fog began to lift. And then he met Isabel. He met her at a friend's barbecue, a brief, sun-drenched afternoon in the otherwise rainy Pacific Northwest autumn. She was 26, an executive assistant at a high-end real estate agency downtown. Her family, Daniel told me, was in property development, flipping luxury condos and managing commercial real estate. They were, in his words, incredibly successful. The first time he brought her home for dinner, I felt a subtle but immediate shift in the atmosphere. It was like a change in barometric pressure, a feeling that a storm was brewing somewhere far off the coast. Isabel was beautiful in a polished, lacquered way. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her clothes impeccably tailored, her smile bright but without warmth. She moved through my home not like a guest, but like an appraiser. "Oh, this is charming," she said, her eyes sweeping over the living room, lingering on the faded chintz armchair where Richard used to read and the collection of sea-worn stones on the mantelpiece. The word charming was pronounced as if it were a synonym for dilapidated. She perched on the edge of the sofa, careful not to let her cream-colored trousers touch the upholstery too fully. I served my signature roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, a dish Daniel had always adored. Isabel picked at it delicately. "I'm trying to cut back on sodium," she explained, offering me that same bright, empty smile. "And I find rustic herbs can be a little overpowering." After she left, Daniel was effusive. "Isn't she amazing, Mom? So smart, so driven." He seemed to float on a cloud of her expensive perfume, which still lingered in the air. "She's very put together," I said carefully. He laughed, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's just not used to older places, that's all. She grew up in a brand new house. She means well." I nodded, a familiar gesture of maternal appeasement, but a small, cold knot had formed in my stomach. It was the feeling a gardener gets when she spots the first, tenacious shoot of Japanese knotweed, a sign of an invasion that, if left unchecked, could tear the very foundations apart. Soon, the small, almost imperceptible changes began. The Sunday cardamom buns were replaced by protein shakes Isabel insisted Daniel drink. Our evenings of old movies gave way to Daniel being on his phone, texting her constantly, a small, secret smile on his face. He no longer offered to help in the garden. Instead, he started pointing out its flaws. "Isabel thinks we should put in a minimalist Zen garden out back," he said one afternoon, gesturing vaguely at my riot of colorful, rambling roses. "She says it would improve the property value." More clean lines. My roses were not about property value. They were about memory, about beauty, about the 30 years of love and care I had poured into them. "I like my roses," I said softly. He sighed, a sound of gentle exasperation that cut me more than any shout. "It was just a suggestion, Mom." Her name became a constant refrain, the justification for every shift away from the life we had so briefly reclaimed. "Isabel says this wallpaper is dreadfully dated. Isabel found this amazing Scandinavian furniture online that would be perfect for this room. Isabel thinks you should wear brighter colors, Mom. Grays and blues are so aging." He started to echo not just her opinions, but her very cadence. My cooking became too heavy. My habit of walking around in my soft wool slippers was so noisy on the hardwood. The quiet, comfortable home I had curated over a lifetime was suddenly, through Isabel's eyes, a portfolio of problems to be solved. Little by little, Daniel began to retreat from me. The shared moments in the sunroom dwindled, then stopped. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped looking at me, really looking at me, with the warmth and affection that had been my lifeline. He looked through me, as if I were a ghost haunting the hallways of my own home, a relic of a past he was eager to renovate. The cold knot in my stomach tightened, a constant, dull ache of anxiety. I told myself I was being oversensitive, a foolish old woman afraid of being replaced. This was the natural order of things, wasn't it? A son leaves his mother for a partner. He builds a new life. I tried to be happy for him. I tried to see Isabel through his eyes. But all I could see was a relentless, quiet erasure of me, of Richard, of everything this house stood for. The breaking point came on a dreary Wednesday afternoon in November. The sky was the color of slate, and a persistent drizzle wept against the windows. Daniel was out for the day at a networking lunch Isabel had arranged for him. I was tidying up, a familiar ritual that usually brought me a sense of peace and order. I went into his room to gather his laundry, the scent of his cologne and her perfume a strange, invasive mix in the air. As I bent to pick up a stray sock, my eyes fell on a stack of mail on his bedside table that he'd brought in but hadn't opened. On top was a thick, official-looking envelope from Sterling Peak Financial. It was addressed to me. My heart gave a little lurch. I never did business with Sterling Peak. I had my small pension and savings managed by Mr. Monroe, the same lawyer who had handled Richard's estate, a man whose integrity was as solid as the granite cliffs along the coast. Curiosity, tinged with a strange premonition, got the better of me. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my finger under the flap. It wasn't junk mail. It was a statement for a home equity line of credit. A HELOC for $75,000, taken out against my property. My home. The page blurred. The numbers seemed to swim. At the bottom of the statement, under Authorized Signatory, was my name. But it wasn't my signature. It was a close, careful forgery, but it lacked the familiar, confident loop of my N. I sank onto the edge of his bed, the letter rattling in my hand. I couldn't breathe. It felt as if the floor had dropped away, leaving me suspended in a cold, terrifying void. $75,000. It was a sum I couldn't even comprehend. What for? Where had it gone? My mind raced, frantically trying to piece it together. The new, expensive watch Daniel had been wearing. The weekend trip to a luxury spa he and Isabel had taken last month, which he'd vaguely claimed was a promotional gift. The whispers and hushed phone calls I'd pretended not to hear. Then, my gaze fell on his laptop bag, left unzipped on the floor. Sticking out of a side pocket was a small, black USB drive. I rarely touched his things, but a desperate, cold certainty took hold of me. I pulled the drive out, my fingers feeling numb and clumsy, and walked on unsteady legs to my own study. I plugged it into my old desktop computer. A single folder appeared on the screen, labeled House Project. I clicked on it. Inside were dozens of audio files, labeled only by date. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on the most recent one. The sound of my own voice filled the quiet room, clear and trusting. It was from a conversation we'd had in the kitchen just last week. And the appraiser said the house is worth at least $800,000, maybe more with the waterfront view. Richard was so proud of that. Then, Daniel's voice, but different. Colder. Clinical. Did she mention the foundation issues in the north corner? And then, Isabel's voice, sharp and dismissive. It doesn't matter. We just need a high enough appraisal for the second phase. Once she's settled at the Pines, we can deal with the cosmetic stuff before we list it. The agent I spoke to said we can get a quick sale if we price it right. Daniel again. She's getting more suspicious, Isabel. She asked me about the mail yesterday. Isabel, with an impatient sigh, Daniel, darling, you need to handle it. She's an old woman. They get confused. Just keep telling her you're taking care of everything. My father says the power of attorney documents should be ready by next week. Once we have that, it's over. We just have to get her signature. A wave of nausea washed over me. I pressed stop, my hand shaking so violently I could barely control the mouse. They had been recording me. In my own home. They had been planning, scheming, discussing my life as if I were a piece of furniture to be disposed of. The Pines. I knew the place. It was a sterile, beige-walled assisted living facility on the other side of town, a place where people went to wait for the end. I scrolled through the other files. There were conversations about selling Richard's things, about my declining cognitive state, about how guilt was a wasted emotion. They were building a case against me, documenting my life to strip it away from me. The forged loan, the recordings, the talk of power of attorney, it was a meticulous, cold-blooded campaign to erase me. The fog of grief I had lived in for 2 years was burned away in an instant by a white-hot flash of clarity. The ache in my stomach was not anxiety, it was a primal instinct, a warning bell I had tried to ignore. The sadness that had clung to me like my wool cardigan was replaced by a different feeling, something harder and colder. It was the quiet, unyielding resolve of a root breaking through concrete. I sat there for a long time, the gray afternoon light fading outside my window, the sound of the rain a steady drumbeat against the roof. I did not cry. Tears were a luxury I could no longer afford. My son, my gentle Daniel, the boy I had raised to be kind and honorable, was a stranger. And he was trying to steal my life. I looked around my study at the photos of Richard and a much younger, happier Daniel on the bookshelf. I looked at the worn spine of my favorite botany textbook. I looked at the view of my garden, its colors muted by the rain. This was my world. And I would not let them take it without a fight. The next morning, I woke before dawn. A strange calmness settled deep in my bones. I made a pot of coffee, the aroma a small, familiar comfort in a world that had become terrifyingly alien. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the sun rise, painting the misty sky in hues of soft pink and gray. When I heard Daniel's car start, heading off to another one of his networking meetings, I went to the old roll-top desk in the study. From a dusty cubbyhole, I pulled out a faded leather address book. My finger traced down the page to Monroe Duncan, attorney at law. Richard had called him a bulldog with a poet's soul. I hadn't spoken to him since the will was settled, but I knew if anyone could help me, it was him. My hand was steady as I dialed the number. Duncan Monroe's office. "This is Nora Sterling," I said, my voice clear and even. "I need to speak with him. It's a matter of utmost urgency." 2 days later, I was sitting across from Mr. Monroe in his mahogany-paneled office above the old Port Blossom bookstore. The room smelled of leather and paper and strong tea. He was a small, fierce man with sharp blue eyes and a shock of white hair that seemed to vibrate with energy. He had listened, without interruption, as I laid out the entire story, my voice never wavering. I handed him the printout of the Helix statement and the USB drive. He put on a pair of reading glasses and examined the document, his lips pursed into a thin, grim line. Then, he plugged the drive into his computer and, with headphones on, listened to one of the recordings. I watched his expression shift from professional concern to stony anger. When he finally took the headphones off, his blue eyes were like chips of ice. "The unmitigated gall," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is fraud, Nora. Elder abuse. Coercion. We can go to the police right now. We can have him arrested." I shook my head. "No, not yet. An arrest would be messy. They would paint me as a confused, vindictive old woman. Isabel's family has money influence. They would bury me in legal fees and public humiliation." I took a deep breath. "I don't want revenge, Duncan. I want to reclaim my life. I want to do it on my own terms. I want them to understand, with no room for doubt, what they have done." He studied me for a long moment, a flicker of something, admiration, perhaps, in his sharp eyes. "All right, Nora," he said, leaning forward. "Let's talk strategy. If we're not going to fight this in a courtroom, we'll fight it in the court of their own making." And so, we began to build my defense. Not with anger, but with precision. Not with shouting, but with silence and strategy. First, we redrafted my will. It was a simple, brutal piece of work. Daniel was removed completely. Every asset, the house, my savings, Richard's investment portfolio, even my collection of antique botanical prints, was to be left in a trust for the Puget Sound Children's Alliance, a charity Richard had passionately supported. The act of signing it felt like severing a gangrenous limb. It was painful, but it was necessary for survival. Next, on Duncan's advice, I began to play a part. He called it strategic compliance. I became the woman they believed me to be, slightly confused, forgetful, and increasingly dependent. I started asking Daniel to read my mail for me, claiming my eyes were getting tired. I'd forget appointments and let him handle my banking online. I even allowed him to take me on a tour of the Pines. I walked through its sterile, beige corridors, smiled wanly at the residents, and told him, "It seems very clean," my voice laced with a believable vulnerability. He and Isabel were delighted. Their guard dropped completely. Their hushed conversations became more frequent and more careless, held in the kitchen while they thought I was napping, or in the car on the way to the grocery store. What they didn't know was that my new hearing aids, recommended by Duncan, weren't just for hearing. They had a recording function. And the new digital photo frame on the mantelpiece, a gift I'd claimed to have bought for myself, had a tiny, motion-activated camera lens. Every evening, I would retreat to my study, transfer the day's recordings, and label them meticulously. I listened to my own life being dismantled, my son's voice a constant, painful betrayal. I heard them mock my gardening, laugh about my old lady habits, and finalize plans for the estate sale that would follow my departure. Each recording was a fresh wound, but it was also a piece of evidence, a stone in the foundation of my defense. My only confidant was my dear friend, Helen, a retired history professor who lived down the road. One afternoon, she stopped by with a lemon drizzle cake and found me in the study, my face pale and strained. She took one look at me and said, "All right, Nora. What's really going on? And don't you dare tell me it's nothing." I told her everything. She listened, her teacup forgotten, her expression hardening from concern to outrage. "That parasitic little witch," she fumed, referring to Isabel. And Daniel, oh Nora, I'm so sorry. She put her arms around me, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself lean on someone else. You have to be careful, she whispered. This is a dangerous game. I know, I said, pulling back, my resolve returning. But it's the only game I have left to play. The invitation arrived a week later. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with embossed silver lettering. Daniel and Isabel requested the pleasure of my company at their engagement party. It was to be held in 2 weeks at the Water's Edge, Port Blossom's most exclusive restaurant and event venue. Daniel presented it to me with a triumphant flourish. Isabel's parents are paying for everything, he said, beaming. It's going to be a huge affair. All their friends, business partners. It's important for my career that we make a good impression. He paused, his expression shifting to one of practiced sincerity. And it would mean the world to us if you were there, Mom. Isabel really wants to formally welcome you into the family. The hypocrisy was so staggering it was almost beautiful. I smiled, a gentle, fragile smile I had perfected over the past month. Of course, darling. I wouldn't miss it for the world. That evening, I called Duncan. The party is in 2 weeks, I said. It's time. What do you have in mind, Nora? They want to make a formal announcement, I replied, my voice steady. Well, I have one of my own. I want to prepare a short video. A tribute to my son. A mother's gift to the happy couple. The video editor Duncan found was a young man named Kyle, who typically worked on corporate training videos and wedding montages. He had a quiet demeanor and asked no questions when I sat with him in his small, dark studio and laid out my collection of flash drives. We started with the heart. I gave him scanned photos of Daniel's childhood, his first steps on the lawn of our house, blowing out the candles on his 5th birthday cake, standing proud in his graduation gown with Richard's arm around his shoulder. Kyle set these images to a soft, sentimental piano score. He added titles in elegant script: A Mother's Pride, A Father's Legacy, A Son's Journey. Then, about 3 minutes in, the tone would shift. The music would fade, replaced by the stark, clear audio of Daniel's voice from one of the recordings. She won't even know what's happening. We'll just tell her it's standard paperwork for her estate. As his voice played, an image of the forged Helic application would appear on the screen, my faked signature highlighted in red. Then Isabel's voice, cool and dismissive. Don't be so dramatic, Daniel. It's for the best. She can't manage this big house by herself anymore. We're doing her a favor. Her words would be overlaid with a photo of the Pines, its beige facade looking like a prison. We wove it all together, the damning audio clips, the scanned documents, the screenshots of bank transfers from the Helic account to Isabel's personal account, labeled Renovation Fund. We ended with the audio of Isabel laughing as she said, "Just imagine what we can do with this place once the old woman is gone." The final frame was just simple white text on a black screen, a message from Nora Sterling. When it was finished, Kyle swiveled in his chair and looked at me, his young face troubled. "It's powerful," he said quietly. "It's the truth," I replied. "And the truth has its own power." The night before the party, I laid out my dress on the bed. It was a deep forest green velvet, a dress Richard had bought for me years ago for a symphony gala. He always said it made my eyes look like moss after a rain. I polished the simple silver locket he had given me and placed it on my vanity. I stood before the mirror and looked at my own reflection, at the fine lines around my eyes, the silver threads in my hair. They were not signs of decay. They were a map of my life, of my love, of my survival. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the quiet room, "the pruning is done." The banquet hall at the water's edge was a vision of shimmering gold and ivory. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over tables laden with white roses and flickering candles. The low hum of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. A string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a scene of perfect, curated elegance, a world away from my quiet, messy garden. I sat at the head table, between Daniel and Isabel, a serene smile fixed on my face. I felt strangely detached, an actress playing a role she knew by heart. I nodded to Isabel's parents, shook hands with their business associates, and accepted compliments on how wonderful it was that Daniel had found such a dynamic partner. After the main course, Isabel stood, tapping her glass with a spoon. The room fell into a respectful silence. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate with us," she began, her voice as smooth and polished as the pearls at her throat. She glowed under the lights, her white dress clinging to her figure. "Daniel and I are so excited to start our new chapter together." Her eyes, bright and triumphant, found mine. "And I especially want to thank my future mother-in-law, Nora. She has shown such incredible grace and self-awareness during this transition. It's not every woman who understands when it's time to step back and make space for the next generation. We are so grateful for her willingness to simplify her life so that we can begin to build ours." A few guests shot me sympathetic glances. Others looked down, a flicker of discomfort on their faces. Daniel stared intently at his dessert fork. Her words were a masterpiece of passive aggression, painting me as a doddering old woman being gently ushered out to pasture. I simply held her gaze, my smile unwavering. "To new beginnings," she finished, raising her glass. A polite, scattered applause followed. As she sat down, I leaned toward the master of ceremonies, who stood nearby, and gave him a small, deliberate nod. He stepped to the microphone. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, "the groom's mother, Mrs. Nora Sterling, has prepared a special video presentation to honor the happy couple." A murmur of pleasant anticipation went through the crowd. Isabel looked surprised, then pleased, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She probably imagined a slideshow of embarrassing baby photos. Daniel shot me a questioning look, but I just patted his hand gently. "A little surprised, dear," I whispered. The lights dimmed. The large projector screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The soft piano music began, and the photos of a cherubic, smiling baby Daniel filled the screen. Guests awed and smiled. I could feel Isabel relax beside me, basking in the sentimental glow. For 3 minutes, the illusion was perfect. It was the story of a loving family, a happy childhood, a mother's endless devotion. Then, the music stopped. The screen went dark for a second before the image of the forged helic application appeared, stark and undeniable. A confused silence fell over the room. And then, Daniel's recorded voice, stripped of all warmth, echoed through the speakers. "She won't even know what's happening. We'll just tell her it's standard paperwork for her estate." A collective gasp went through the hall. I saw Isabel's face drain of all color. She started to rise, but I placed a firm hand on her arm, my grip surprisingly strong. "Sit down, Isabel," I murmured, my voice low and cold. "The show is just beginning." The video played on, a relentless montage of their deceit. Isabel's voice discussing my declining cognitive state. The picture of the pines. The screenshots of the bank statements showing my money flowing into their lives. The final, damning line, "Just imagine what we can do with this place once the old woman is gone," hung in the dead, silent air like a toxic cloud. When the screen faded to black, the silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. You could hear the fizz of champagne bubbles dying in their glasses. Slowly, I rose from my chair and turned to face the stunned audience. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. It was the calm, clear voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. For 35 years, I was a wife and a mother. I dedicated my life to creating a home filled with love, security, and integrity. I taught my son the value of honesty, the importance of compassion, and the meaning of family. I turned my head slightly to look at Daniel. He was staring at me, his face a mask of horror and disbelief, as if he couldn't connect the man in the recordings to the son who sat at this table. "Tonight, you have seen the truth of how that love has been repaid. You have seen a methodical plan to defraud me, to declare me incompetent, and to remove me from my home and my life for financial gain." From a quiet corner of the room, Mr. Monroe stepped forward, a leather folio in his hand. He stood beside me, a small bulldog of a man radiating quiet authority. "This is my attorney, Duncan Monroe," I announced. "He has in his possession all of the original recordings and documents, copies of which have already been sent to Sterling Peak Financial's fraud department and to the Port Blossom Police Department." A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the guests. Isabel made a small, strangled sound. "The home equity loan has been frozen pending a full investigation into felony forgery and elder financial abuse," Mr. Monroe stated, his voice sharp and precise. I stepped forward again, my eyes locked on my son. "And as of last month, my last will and testament has been rewritten. You are no longer my heir, Daniel. Everything my husband and I worked our entire lives to build, every penny, every asset, every last rose bush in my garden, will go to the Puget Sound Children's Alliance to help children who have truly lost everything." The dam of shock finally broke. Isabel's father, a large, florid man, shot to his feet, sputtering in outrage. Isabel buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, furious sobs. Daniel finally stood, his hands trembling. "Mom, please," he stammered, his voice cracking. Can we talk about this? Privately?" I looked at him, at the boy I had loved more than life itself, and I felt not anger, but a vast, empty chasm of sorrow. "No, Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but final. "There will be no more private conversations. No more whispers. The time for secrets is over." I picked up my small evening bag from the table. "You are not the son I raised," I said softly, the words a final, clean cut. "You are a stranger. And as of tonight, you are trespassing in my house." And with that, under the warm glow of the chandeliers and the cold glare of 100 stunned eyes, I turned my back on the ruins of their meticulously planned future and walked away. The exodus was quiet and swift. Isabel's parents ushered their daughter out a side door, her face hidden from view. Daniel followed, his head bowed, the guests parting for him like the sea, not wanting to be touched by the stain of his disgrace. No one said goodbye. Mr. Monroe and I were the last to leave. He simply squeezed my arm and said, "Well done, Nora." Richard would have been proud. In the days that followed, a quiet solidarity settled over my small neighborhood. Helen brought over homemade soup and a bottle of surprisingly good whiskey. Other neighbors left pots of flowers on my porch, their unspoken support a gentle comfort. The world, which had felt so hostile, began to feel kind again. The locks were changed the next day. A security company swept the house and removed 2 more listening devices I had missed. The bank, faced with irrefutable evidence, canceled the fraudulent loan and launched its own internal investigation. Duncan handled everything, ensuring every legal loose end was tied up, protecting me behind a wall of notarized documents and legal injunctions. A week later, I packed a small suitcase, booked a train ticket south along the coast, and left Port Blossom in the rearview mirror. I spent 2 weeks in a small, sun-drenched town in California, a place where no one knew my name. I walked on the beach, I read novels in sun-warmed courtyards, and I ate my meals alone, savoring the taste of my own choices. I rediscovered the quiet pleasure of my own company. When I returned, the house felt different. It was empty, but it was a clean, peaceful emptiness. It was mine again. I hired a painter, and we painted the living room a warm, buttery yellow, the color of daffodils in spring. I spent hours in my garden, my hands in the earth, pulling weeds and nurturing new growth. I was no longer a ghost in my own home. I was its heart, its soul, its fierce and gentle guardian. A month ago, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was Daniel's, hesitant and unfamiliar. I opened it with a strange sense of detachment. It was a long, rambling letter filled with apologies, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. He wrote of Isabel's influence, of his own weakness and shame, of his desperation to be the man he thought she wanted him to be. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer in my study, alongside a box of spare fuses and old seed packets. Forgiveness, I am learning, is a complex and private garden. It does not require you to replant invasive species. It does not mean you must allow the weeds back in. Perhaps it is simply the act of clearing the soil, of making space for something new and healthy to grow, on its own terms, in its own time. My life is quiet now, but it is a vibrant quiet, filled with the rustle of leaves, the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the steady, reassuring beat of my own heart. I have learned that dignity is not something that can be taken from you. It is a root that you can choose to nourish, to protect, to fight for, even in the harshest of winters. And you learn that sometimes the most profound act of love is not to hold on, but to know when and how to let go.